Hi everyone, Jay here from Jade Productions. Welcome back to another beginner's guide video. So, in this beginner's guide video, we're going to be looking at the Daughters of Khaine. The Daughters of Khaine are an Order army, and they're definitely like one of the darkest and evilest armies amongst the Order grouping. They're very interesting to collect and play, mostly because they mix very well the styles of Death Star Horde, which is very common in Age of Sigmar, being very melee focused with large groups of infantry, and then mixing well with small elite units with their Bloodstalkers, and they are able to do a nice mix between, but their real strengths come from being pretty fast, above average, but also being very, very murderous. Like, they are extremely skilled and very, very good fighters. Lots of attacks, lots of dice being thrown at enemies for lots of damage. They very much can slice through just about any horde with the right buffs. And even as an older book that was released in Age of Sigmar 1.5, which is what I call the General's Handbook, in Age of Sigmar 1, and then having been written at the time for Age of Sigmar 2, and having come out with several other books before Age of Sigmar 2nd edition, still very much works in the current Age of Sigmar, is still very good, still fantastic. Now, let's dive right in. So, the Daughters of Khaine, first things first, when it comes to buying them, typically, my advice would be, if you're going to set out and start immediately buying Age of Sigmar Daughters of Khaine kits, do yourself a favor. Start with either 2 cauldron boxes or 2 get starting boxes. Now, here's the reason for this. In there, you're going to get some essential units that you basically need for your army, and this is where it comes in. Now, your choice between which one of these to buy, if you haven't already purchased these, is, well, you should buy 2 of them, and they'll give you your core command of your army, right? If you buy just 2 cauldron kits, that'll give you a core command. If you buy 2 of the get starting boxes, which I would maybe recommend in this situation, as it'll get you essentially some free units, is you then get your core command, and on top of that you get 2 of your Bloodstalker units, or Blood Sister units, depending on how you want to build them. I recommend Blood Sister. But it gives you some snakes, which will form some elite units that are nice heavy hitters, and then from there you can buy yourself some Witch Elves. There's not a whole lot of variety in this army, and most of it is multi-build kit. Unlike a lot of armies, your choices between which of the 2 things am I building out of this kit that I just got is a lot more simpler. For example, when you get your 2 get starting boxes, you'll want to build your cauldron of... the first thing you'll want to build is your cauldron of blood. And you want to use your spare parts from that particular kit to then build yourself a spare Medusae. Get yourself a spare base, put her on that. Okay? Then, what you'll want to do is get your second kit and build that cauldron kit as a Bloodrack Shrine, which uses the Bloodrack Medusa on that shrine, some mirror parts, creates a very good unit that you'll want, but is less important than your Cauldron of Blood. Your Cauldron of Blood is like, you'll hear me talk about it in this video a lot, it's your be-all and end-all. Once you've built your Bloodrack Shrine, you use your spare parts from that kit to build yourself some Slaughter Queens and Hag Queens. And you can potentially use it to build yourself a Avatar of Khaine on foot, not that you'll ever really want to run one, unless you're just having a good time. So, you've got that, right? And now, if you buy that as the get starting boxes instead, you'll also get some snakes to go along with it. In which case, you bought 2 of those, you've already got the decent foundings of a 1,000 to 2,000 point army. So that's where that comes into it. Now, The second thing you want to buy is Witch Elves. Now these are bread and butter, hands down one of the best units in Age of Sigmar. They're your probably, I want to say they're tied for best unit in the Daughters of Khaine book. I say that because what you can do to them, you can also do to large groups of snakes. And the end result is basically one will kill one thing better, the other one will kill another thing better. One will be slightly more durable due to wound count. It tosses and turns, so they end up being about tied. But the sheer amount of attacks that Witch Elves put out would typically just put them just above the Blood Sisters. But Witch Elves, you're going to need to buy them. And once again, they're a double kit. They make Witch Elves and they make Sisters of Slaughter. Now, unlike the snakes or the Kennerai, which are the harpy ones, the difference here is that the Kennerai and the Melusai, the snakes, they have 2 build options in their kits, but in terms of gameplay, one is vastly better than the other. But it also makes it easy to collect this army at the same time, because you can go on, get the ones you need, build them as you need, and then maybe pick up another extra box just to have 1 unit of everything. Very feasible thing to do. Because the things you need max units of are going to be Witch Elves. Your high model count is going to be in your smaller infantry, which are cheaper, fortunately. Here, with the Witch Elves, their alternate build, the Sisters of Slaughter, which are the whip-wielding ones, are a useful utility unit that pairs well with the Witch Elves. So, get used to buying a lot of this box. If you have a lot of this box, the first thing you want to build is some Witch Elves, and then you want to build some Sisters of Slaughter. Because they pair well together, they tend to like to operate together, and they perform well on the tabletop together. The Witch Elves sort of march forward, get into the charge, and then the Sisters of Slaughter work as kind of like trap units, which help pen in enemy units, and really limit their mobility options, and they're great for mind games. It's a hard faction to learn, this faction, but it can be done. You just gotta know what you're, get used to your army, and once you realize the shenanigans and when to charge, when not to charge, and get used to ranges and when to apply your buffs, you'll be kicking and going in no time, and you will do very well, most of the time. They're a good, solid army, even with their bad choices, which is good. So, your Blood Sisters are an alternative to the Witch Elves, but they are, once again, you can't field them as many models, which leads to some interesting things. And you can even field your Blood Sisters in large units as well. Their trick is that they wound better without buffs, and they have built-in rend and reach on their weapons. So they're nice, and they've got mortal wound potential. So they're great for eliminating very elite units. But your Witch Elves are what you send to crack something. Now, a lot of debate is there when it comes to Witch Elves and Sisters of Slaughter. What is better in terms of build, when you're building your models? One of the questions is often, do you take the Sacrificial Dagger, or do you take the Bladed Buckler? So, for the record, the paired Sacrificial Dagger, if you have 2 of them, gets you an extra attack. That sounds immediately like the one you would want. But, there's a question. Is it worth it compared for that extra attack if the guys with the extra attack aren't going to reach the combat? And this is why I believe that you're better off going with the Bladed Bucklers, and why every Daughters of Khaine player I know has gone with Bladed Bucklers as well. Now, even if you just like the look of the blades and you want those extra attacks, when you're building it, put your Bladed Bucklers on the units that are going to be larger, if you want a more defensible blob, or put it on the smaller units if you plan to put your Witch Elves to work sort of on the sidelines. Capping objectives, running in, killing smaller things, being small unit tactics, MSU. Now, I kind of don't think that's one of the best options, but I definitely recommend you have a unit with the bladed bucklers, because your army is very, very fragile. That is a thing. You hit extremely hard with this army, but you're very fragile. So they give you a build option in your kit for the core of your army to possibly go from a 6-up save with a 6-up to ignore damage to a 5-up to ignore damage. Sorry, to a 5-up save and a 6-up ignore damage. Now, that in itself, a 5-up save is not a huge thing, but it can potentially mean less saves you're going to have to be taking, and you can combine it with things like the Blood Shield from your Cauldron to get even more buffs to defense. You're still going to die in droves, but the more you can keep that unit alive, the better it'll be. So, I definitely recommend the Bladed Buckler in general over the Knife, because you're going to have enough attacks as it is, typically. Because you're going to get an extra attack if you charge and you're near a hero, which you ideally always want to be. This is what it comes back to. There's a lot of positioning in this army. That's key. So you're going to get, on average, you're going to get minimum 2 attacks, which is fantastic. You can then get yourself up to a 3 attacks, and then you can get yourself with some prayers exploding attacks. And then you can even bump that up further. So there's ways you can do it. Now, so that's why paired blades, they're not essential. You can go for the bladed buckler. And the bladed buckler, on top of letting you having the ability to get yourself a 5-up save, each time you make a save roll of a 6 in combat, after rerolls but before any modifiers, that's an important point, the unit that attacked you suffers a mortal wound, which is something that this army does very well, is it punishes your enemy for fighting back. That doesn't sound like it'll go off a lot, but with the sheer number of attacks that units can throw out, especially good units, the units that you want to be sending your Witch Elves into to kill, them hesitating to fight you is so wonderful that it's worth it in itself. And you can combine that with other things such as Temple Nest. Unfortunately, I don't think Temple Nest actually makes use of those. I have to check. But yeah, still, the fact that they can hurt you, or rather the fact that they can hurt themselves from attacking you, worth it combined with a 5-up save. It's got more synergy, I feel. So, my recommendation would definitely be, when it comes to the Sisters of Slaughter, give them the bucklers every time. When it comes to the Witch Elves, you're going to have to make a choice. How many Witch Elf units are you fielding? If you're only fielding one massive Witch Elf blob, that's all you want to build them all with the Bladed Buckler. Okay? If you want to build yourself multiple big blobs, and you're fine with buying and building lots and then painting lots and lots of individual Witch Elves, then mix it up. And if you're feeling multiples, then you go with the double blades. Because then you're more likely to get your double blades, and you're more likely to get your max number of attacks into the battle line, because you'll have multiple things that your enemy will have to deal with and engage. Now, when you've got your snakes, the better unit to build is the Blood Sisters, so the ones with the pole arms. They're the better unit. They're an alternative to the Witch Elves in terms of giving you nice hitting power. They've got the 5-up save, they've got the 6-up, so they've got the mill stuff. They deal mortal wounds with their Crystal Touch. They're pretty good, they're solid. They have one thing, though, where if you are going to field them in big units, make sure you don't build for more than 15, because if you build for 20, now, This is something I've been in a bit of debate with, but I feel confident recommending this to you, because 20 becomes an unwieldy brick, and trying to get that many attacks in, depending on circumstances, that can actually work to your detriment, especially for a unit like this. So, the Blood Sisters are definitely one of those things. Max 15 if you're going to build for big units. Otherwise, units of 5 to 10 are pretty fantastic. Units of 5 are good for going on the flanks and chopping apart elite units and enemy characters. Units of 10 are good for chopping through elite units with high armor saves, typically anything 4+ or better, with their inbuilt rend. If you can stack Mind Razor on them, that's pretty good, along with some other prayers. Get them to wound. They've got fantastic attack stats. And then they're also pretty good for dealing with enemy monsters, which is something that, you always need to be prepared for. A monster by itself is not fantastic in Age of Sigmar, but, sometimes people bring them. Their entire army is dedicated to bring them. If you can catch the monster by themselves, these things do pretty well against them. They do even better when supported by things like Witch Elves. Depending on the monster, Witch Elves versus Blood Sisters is a good argument you're going to have to take. I typically find that you probably want to include both in your army. Like, when you're building your list, you probably want to take a good mix of these. The Blood Stalkers, you probably don't need to build as many of them. They're okay. They're good shooting. They just don't have the number of attacks. They've got the range, but they don't have much synergy with the rest of your army. Shooting is not something this army does well. So when you go to build them, only build a few units of the Bloodstalkers. I would probably only recommend, if you're going to buy 2 get starting boxes, as I recommend, build those as Blood Sisters, then buy another box, build them as Blood Sisters, and then maybe buy 1 more after you've got at least enough to make a squad of 15. Buy 1 more so you can have a squad of 5 Bloodstalkers. If you find Bloodstalkers really work with you, go up to a max of 10, but they're not battle line. They can't be battle line like the Blood Sisters can, so you can't replace things with them, and you're not going to win the shooting game, but you will be able to provide some nice supporting fire. However, that being said, there's definitely a better unit in your army for doing that. Which brings us to the Khenri and Doomfire. So the Khenri, another one of those multi-build kits, where one is obviously better than the other. There's the Heartrenders, which are the better version. They're the ones with spears. They're fast, mobile, they can do hit and run attacks, and they've got great shooting. And that great shooting is helped by the fact that they have the movement shenanigans. They're also great for securing objectives, flying around, harassing enemies. They're a great skirmish unit. 2 units of these popped into your army, 2 units of 5, can't go wrong with them. They're pretty good. So they're a good thing to build first. The Life Takers are essentially witches with wings. But the problem with that is that they outpace a lot of their buffs. You've got to dedicate to them, and your points for what you're getting is you're getting essentially half the number of models of witches than you are. So the Life Takers are pretty garbage, but you can build them. They have their uses. Once again, I would recommend you build the Heartrenders first. Build the Heartrenders first, because they're much more useful of the 2. And then go back and build some Life Takers. The Life Takers and the Heartrenders, they can work in tandem pretty well. But if you're only going to pick and use one, while the Life Takers are cheaper, the Heartrenders are better utility all around. The Doomfires are the Doomfire Warlock is your light cavalry unit. Don't be confused by the term cavalry. They are skirmish cavalry. Your heavy hitters in this army will be your snakes with staves and your witch elves. The Doomfire Warlocks, what they have going for them is that the bigger they are, the bigger the squad, the more powerful their magic is, with greater damage output for mortal wounds, which makes them immediately great. They can do a little bit of everything with shooting, moving, melee, but don't expect them to live very long. So when you build them in units of 10 to 15. just do that, and you'll be pretty rewarded. 10. The issue typically is that you need 10 to get your best buffs, but the moment you lose 1, which your opponent will immediately do, they'll go, 10 Doomfire Warlocks, I'll just kill 1, and then I don't have to worry about your super damage. So that's why 15 can be good, because then they've got to get through, 10 wounds instead. It's 2 wound horses. So 15 can be better. 20 is overkill. If you're going to field 20, just do 2 units of 10 instead when it comes time to field them. But they are good to buy and build 20 of them in general. You can't go wrong. They're a fantastic unit. And they definitely, while they're fragile, they will hit very hard. And they give you a lot of options. And they've got some synergy with certain builds. They typically come as a fairly good unit. They just can't quite hack it out in melee. And their shooting's not super fantastic. But they're good in the backfield. Casting magic spells with their Doom Bolt. Running around the backfield taking objectives. Flanking enemy forces. Denying space for your enemy to do movement shenanigans. Just, in general, a good unit. Buy them, though, and build them, though, after you've got yourself your Cauldron and some Witch Elves. Again, my recommendation is that if you're going to do this, get into Daughters of Khaine, when you pick up all your boxes, and if you say you just buy a whole bunch of stuff, build your Cauldron, and then a Blood Rack Shrine, then build yourself a good 30-man unit of elves, of Witch Elves, then get yourself 2 units of 10 Sisters of Slaughter, and then get yourself some Blood Sisters, and then get yourself, maybe 15 Blood Sisters, and then get yourself maybe 10 Kennerai, and, 20 Doomfires. And that's a good solid base of an army. That's what most armies will be on the field. So now, when it comes to using these, some pitfalls and some notes from experienced players and myself that I've learned, both fighting against them and with these units. Typically, first things first, when it comes to building and when it comes to gaming, never leave home without your Cauldron or Hag Queen. You need Hag Queens at a minimum, but the Cauldron is what you want. Even then, you probably want a Cauldron and 2 Hag Queens. That's typically what you want. That would be 3 units in your command roster. I would take those, and then maybe a Blood Rack Shrine if you're playing at 2,000 point level. If you're only playing at a medium level, 1,500 or below, take 1 Cauldron and 2 Hags. They're good. The Cauldron is always a must. And minimum 1 Hag is always a must. But because of how frail they are, they're not fantastic at killing and taking on enemy characters. You want them nearby, though, for their buffs. Especially depending on the number of Hag Queens you want, probably correspond to the number of big killy Death Star units you want. So if you're running 2 big units of something, say a big unit of 15 Blood Sisters and a unit of 30 Witch Elves, you'll want a Hag Queen for each, and then a Cauldron just in case one of those Hag Queens dies. And then one of those units will be moving up with the Cauldron, hopefully, if you're doing this right. One of the key things, again, about this army is your buffs are really powerful, but you've got to be really on the ball with your positioning, and you've got to be really aware of how far things can move and movement. Now, there is a thing in this army where your command points are mostly not going to be spent on a lot of things outside of the generic command traits. Mostly because the Hag Queens don't have one, but the Cauldron of Blood doesn't have one either. So it's one of those things of the only real things with command abilities is your Slaughter Queen, which is worth having one of these. However, it's worth it. It's probably the only thing you're going to spend a command point on other than the advancing. because Morathi's command ability is just not worth it. It's not worth making her general. So, one Hag Queen, one Slaughter Queen is a good alternative, I would say. I've seen that run and be very successful. So, Cauldron, Hag Queen, Slaughter Queen, or Cauldron, 2 Hag Queens, depending on what you want. The Slaughter Queen, her entire usefulness pretty much comes down to the fact that she can unbind 1 spell. She's a priestess with, you know, well, her prayers are okay. They're not fantastic. Just had to look at them to refresh myself. But it is the ability to... her command ability is the only one, you know, worth spending points on. And it's good. And once again, though, it does come down to that positioning. It's a good way to overkill. And it's very good when you stacked on the things that we've talked about. So, there is that. Other than that, the rest of your command points, back onto the topic of movement and positioning, will probably be spent on rerolling charges or making your runs crucial. Now, you already do move super fast. On average, a Witch Elf moves 6 inches, which is just above average. And then they've got the movement shenanigans of Hornblowers. They can charge even if they ran, so you always want to be running. And you always want Hornblowers. So you've got that. And you can... your Blood Rights will give you reroll 1s if you are out of CP on your runs and charges in turn 2. So, you've got ways of buffing your movement, and it's one of those things of sometimes when the movement can get like that, and you are presented with the opportunity because one squad rolled really well with its run, that is now able to charge and get in there. Is it worth committing to that charge? Because the units that buffed them are too far behind and you're just outside of that 8-inch aura of the Hag Queen or the 14-inch aura of the Slaughter Queen to finish an enemy off. You don't have the durability to really get hit back. If you do, you're going to take a lot of casualties. You want to decapitate them first go. You want to kill as much as you can, as quickly as you can with this army. Because you are not durable. And that kind of is incentivized in this army. Be aggressive, but know when to be aggressive in that case. And that ties into your movement. When it comes to building for when you look at your book and you look at your sub-factions, there's no wrong answer when it comes to building your sub-factions. They're all good, typically, with the exception of Kraith. Kraith is bad. If you're playing Kraith, I respect you for committing to it. But that's the only bad one. Even then, it's not terrible. It's not good. You have better options. So the next point is when it comes to, and I would say this falls under building as well as playing, you want a specific ratio of Witch Elves to Sisters of Slaughter. So I want to say this ratio is 2-to-1. Some people might say 3-to-1. But typically it's, I would say and recommend to you when it comes to building stuff, you definitely want to put, you know, a unit of 30 Witch Elves on the field and 2 units of 10 Sisters of Slaughter. And that's where it comes down to in that ratio of figuring out how to field those, because the Sisters of Slaughter, they don't hit nearly as hard, but they are great utility. They do some work. They're really good for mind games, they're great distractions, and they're good for penning foes in and preventing their movement and preventing them from fighting back really effectively with their pile-in shenanigans. And that's typically where they go. They're a great ambush that way. Nice gotcha moment when you can get them to go off. And, you know, you have those go along the flanks, ensuring that whatever tries to escape your big 30-man blob of Witch Elves is probably going to get caught by these, or if you have something that decides, your opponent just decides, alright, I'm just going to commit to this and charge your 30-man Witch Elves, you have these, which, if they're close enough, can intervene and pile in 6 inches and get in there and just pile on the extra damage. So, when it comes to building them, I I definitely recommend building in that ratio as well. Just keep it a 2-to-1 for Witch Elves versus Sisters of Slaughter when you're building those. A very important thing to keep in mind, because this is a question I've seen a few people ask. Remember your blood rights stack. Do remember them. By the time you get to blood rights on turn 4 and 5, they're not really useful. It's your first 3 blood rights that are the essential ones. Those are the good ones. And that's because they help with the movement, the charging, and then finally just helping you hit better and make sure you get those kills in with the reroll ones to hit. And that can synergize well with other things. The last 2, they're not super fantastic because by the last turn either everything's dead and you have Witch Brew in your army, which if you're not always using that or using your abundance of CP, hopefully, that you have either been spending on either movement or only the slaughter of Orgy of Slaughter, then you'll have ways of auto-passing Battle Shock. Battle Shock's not a huge part for this army. Your final, the one that lets you, that blood right, don't really worry about it. You've got other ways of ignoring it really early on. It's not important that you bump up your blood rights table, which is an ability that is available to you through certain synergies to make units count higher on that. It's not important. You have other ways. Just remember those first 3. They're the important ones. Second thing, because this army focuses and favors the whole playstyle of have your army really close together and move it all up the field in that one thing of if basically that Death Star, anything touches you, you can swamp it and they kill it because you've buffed your units to an insane degree that they've got the best protection you can give them. They'll kill anything they touch. Be aware, even with your mobility options, even with the fact that you move slightly faster than everyone else, your Witch Elves move slightly faster, your Snakes move slightly faster, and that you've got plenty of ways of running and charging, you need to be aware about committing heavily to one side of the board. Objectives win games more times than just flat out killing your opponent. If you can kill them quickly enough, that will win you the game because then you'll just be able to disperse. But if a faction is really resilient, thinking of things like Fire Slayers, who are really, really resilient, or Iden of Deepkin, who are really, really resilient, if you commit too heavily to one side of the table, it can be a real pain and it can potentially lose you the game depending on the scenario, having to try and slog as quickly as you can over to the other side of the table to finish off their units or claim objectives. That's why you have things like the Kennerai Heart Renders and the Doomfire Warlocks to help cover that weakness. And there's other synergies you can build to try and cover that weakness. But be aware of it. Invest in some mobility buffs. Be aware about your mobility, how far you can reach. This is a faction where I highly recommend you definitely do a lot of pre-measuring. Especially if you're new, don't be afraid to pre-measure. Don't be afraid to do that. You need to know the exacts of how far you can move at all times with this army because of that. Just be aware when you're committing too heavily to one side. Be aware of what your enemy can move, where he can move it. It's one of those skills that you've got to pick up the more you play this game, and it varies by faction. So it helps for you to play against lots of different factions if you can. Trying to predict how the Caradon player will move, how the units with fly will move, that kind of thing. Do you have them pinned in, or is there a way they can fly past you? If they can fly past you, and they fly to the other cross the board, or they deep strike, or they have units in reserve, how are you going to respond? How can you respond? Have you put everything over here in this corner, and now you have no way of getting back across to the other side of the board? Shooting is not your strong point in this army. You have some okay shooters in terms of just general skirmishing. Your better skirmish units are the Doomfires and the Heart Renders. They're definitely the shooting units I would advise you to invest in, money-wise and points-wise. The Blood Stalkers do their job okay, but they're very much sit in the back line, deny space. They've got the range compared to your other shooting units, but shooting is not something you excel in. You don't have a lot of buffs for shooting. So, bear that in mind. What you see is what you get when it comes to shooting. There's no real ways to make that really transcend what is on the sheet. Now, just some other general tips and bits. Firstly, never make Morathi your general. Never, ever, ever make her your general. When you build her in an army, she's a fantastically expensive model, both points and money-wise. But build around her, if that's the case. She's not, as much as I want to say she's a throwaway unit, she's too pricey to be that. So you've basically got two options when it comes to fielding Morathi. You can basically build an army around Morathi, or you can build an army plus Morathi. If you're building around Morathi, you're going to do that at a low points level, 1500 and below. If you're building an army plus Morathi, you're going to do that at the 2000 points level. So the differences between those two concepts, to let me explain that real quick, is that an army built around Morathi is you're building with the sole purpose of Morathi's at the center. She's going to be doing your heavy lifting, and everything else there is there to support her. So you have snakes with shooting, you have snakes, big units of snakes and Kanarai around to do stuff. You have your cauldron to support her and your larger units of snakes. And you tend on making use of her in every single one of her facets, both as a powerful spellcaster, as a beatstick, and as an immovable clump. You intend to use her in every facet. That's how you build around her in a small scale game. Now, building an army plus Morathi is what you'll do at a larger point, I feel, because building around Morathi is not the most effective way to run Daughters of Khaine. It's not the most effective way, but it can be fun and it does work at lower levels. Building an army plus Morathi works better at the higher points levels. And building an army plus Morathi essentially means you build your bog standard 1500 points of what you would normally bring. Your Cauldron, your Bloodshrek, big unit of Witch Elves, maybe some Sister Slaughter, maybe some Kanarai, maybe some Blood Stalkers, if you're desperate, but definitely some Blood Sisters. Sure, yep, you build your generic army however you want. You'll be cutting off a good 500 points of your army. And that is probably 500 points you would normally spend on things like mobility options, like Doomfire Warlocks, or things like Kanarai, or a big unit of Blood Sisters. You know, things that you would normally buy in your list after you built the core of your army out. So whatever is that, you'll be sacrificing 500 points of that for Morathi, who will join your army and basically use her High Oracle form to fill in as a great spellcaster, deliver some debilitating effects, do some spells, get some great casting off, do some endless spells, which while you don't have any specific ones for your army, there are some good go-to ones that are pretty fantastic, that she's got a good chance of casting. And then you can make use of her snake form as well. The choice obviously always, I feel, comes up to what army you're fighting. Typically, you want to use her High Oracle form, you know, on maybe the first 2 turns when you're not into melee and your enemy's a good distance apart. Make use of those spells, make use of those endless spells, put those buffs on there for those units that are going to be running up the board as fast as possible, getting that first or second turn charge that you can so easily do with this army. And that is the thing that you'll do with her. When it comes to her snake form, the snake form is what you decide. You put her to that in the 3rd round or immediately if you're expecting to receive the charge. If you are expecting to receive the charge, you didn't get first turn, you couldn't make that first turn charge, and you're expecting the counterattack to come and hit you, put Morathi in her snake form. Morathi in her snake form is something she's not as great a magic caster anymore, but now she can deal a fair amount of damage, but her key thing is you just throw her at something that you don't want to fight. That's what you do with her snake form. She becomes a very big tar pit, because their choice will either be to try and hack their way through her for 3 turns, or retreat and run into the jaws of the rest of your army. So there's some interesting ways to use Morathi in that way, but essentially it boils down to, what are you fighting? Are you receiving the charge or not? Now, there's no reason when it comes to formulating your army and building stuff around it. As I said earlier, when it comes to building this army model-wise and building your armies list-wise, all of the sub-factions are good except for Kraith. So there's no... And your generic traits are range from okay to bad. Especially your command traits. Your relics are pretty good all around, mostly. Your best relics definitely belong to the ones that buff your priests. So potentially there's one in there called the Iron Circlet that you always want. But there's never a reason not to take a sub-faction, unless you really just want to be unique and different. If you can't, especially if you want to be very, very competitive, if you can't pick one, or you just don't know what to do, or you don't want to go through the trouble of picking your generic options and putting together your stuff, go with Hagnar. It's very generic for your army. It's the most generic one it is, but it makes you very, very good at what the things you already are good at. Makes you hit harder, gives you a bit more survivability. You're going to murder and chew through everything much, much, much better. So, it's one of those things. Hagnar, if you have, if you're paralyzed by decisions. Calibron is a other one for sub-factions that you can pick. I would say it's probably the best one after Hagnar. The two of them do different purposes. Essentially, Calibron helps protect you and helps round out your army from things that you're weak against. For example, Calibron gives you the ability to teleport units around the field, which helps solve that mobility problem if you overcommit. It also just helps you get more mobility on the field, which in general is just a very good thing. And it helps protect you from shooting, which is a very good thing, because you don't have a lot of ways to protect yourself from shooting. You don't have very good ways to shoot back. And most opponents immediately thought, because they know how good Daughters of Khaine are in combat, is to try and gun you down before you reach them. So Calibron provides some good protection for that. So it's one you can build around. Hagnar is another one that's okay. Drychi Ganeth is very good. It's very good. I wouldn't recommend it over Hagnar and Calibron, but it's one you can build into. And it's worth a look if you just want to focus in on killing stuff even better. But Hagnar is... If you can't decide on generic stuff, go Hagnar. Calibron rounds out your army. When it comes to just general movement as well, and I bang on about this point a little bit, and it's one of those pitfalls. Screening is an important thing in this army, and the thing is, your cauldrons and characters, they're not the toughest units in the game, but they are very important to your strategy, so your opponent is going to want to remove them as quickly as possible, mostly to get rid of Witchbrew. They'll go after your Slaughter Queens to get rid of Orgy of Slaughter, and they just want to remove your prayers and your base buffs and that one command ability that is really good that you have. They want to get rid of that as quick as possible, which means you need to be protecting your cauldrons and your hags. You need to be protecting those. Very much in the early game. It's not until the mid-game, when both sides are depleted, do you definitely want to send them into combat. I definitely advise you don't want to send your hags or slaughter queens into combat almost at all, unless you're really, really desperate. And in which case you want them to buff themselves with prayers and abilities. And the only time you want them to be doing that is when whatever they were buffing is already dead. The Cauldron is, in particular, the Cauldron of Blood is very important to your army. You definitely don't want it to die early on. You want it to move up, be supported. You want to screen it with some of your Kennerai or Stalkers behind it, making sure it doesn't get outflanked. You want to flank it with some of your... typically, I find Blood Sisters definitely work better in the role. There's nice bodyguard units of 5. Or Witch Elves if you've reversed it and you're taking the big units of Blood Sisters instead. And you screen it, and it provides the buff to the units that are further up in the field, whatever your big unit is that you're planning to hammer in your opponent's face with. And only at turn 3, when the avatar no longer has to be activated because of your blood rights. That is when you want to do it. Because at turn 3, you no longer have to cast the prayer which brings your Avatar of Khaine to life. And because of that, from turn 3 onwards, your Cauldron of Blood now becomes a pretty good at walloping stuff, because the Avatar of Khaine gives it some decent hitting power. So, and it deals mortal wounds on the charge, so that's a good time to commit it. Before that, definitely pull back, keep the Cauldron in reserve a little bit. Don't, if you have an easy charge, don't just go, oh yeah, I'll charge it in there. Or I have room after my 30 Witch Elves charge that unit because I've got them on the flank. No. Hold your Cauldron back until turn 3. Protect that. The Cauldron's alternate build, the Bloodrack Shrine, throw that up there. Throw that up there because you want it in range to deal its mortal wounds with the Medusa's Stare attack. That essentially works like a giant turning people to stone flamethrower. It's very good. It's very good at depleting enemy hordes, very good at killing enemy bricks, and things like Hearthguard. Just mortal wounds in general are just very good, especially when you can spread them around that much. So it's a good way to cover a lot of models, and it's got a decent range. So that one you want to throw up there, maybe around turn 2. So that one don't feel too bad about committing to battle with. The thing is, if you lose the Bloodrack Shrine, you will lose your Medusa, who's a caster. So don't put your eggs into baskets with that one. Ironically, this is the faction of put all your eggs into one basket, whether that basket be Witch Elves or Blood Sisters. But at the same time, don't put all your eggs into one basket when it comes to your characters. And when it comes to your characters, definitely your magic is good. Your Lore of Shadows is very good in this army, but your prayers are more important. So be aware of that. Good go-to spells are Withering, Mind Razor, and Steed of Shadows. Very good spells to go with. Your prayers combo well with Hags and Cauldrons buffs that they're already giving out. And they go on things like your Witches and Blood Sisters. And they're things like Catechism Murder, Blessing of Khaine. Very good go-to prayers on top of the base prayers that the priests already have. Those are good. And you want to be aware of those. Those are very good. When it comes to your shooting game, I've already talked about this. Your Bloodstalkers are good, but they're not great. Heart Renders are better than Life Takers in every aspect, and they're also better at shooting. They just have half the range. But at the same time, they're far more mobile and they have movement shenanigans. The only thing where they differ is the only point where they differ is their price point. The Heart Renders cost an extra 10 points. Medusae are good. They're an important toolbox. I'd recommend you have at least one. Again, if you're playing a small game, take one on foot. If you're playing a large game, take one on a shrine. Never take the Avatar of Khaine on foot. Just take the Cauldron, wait till round 3, then it will be able to fight without you having to waste your very important prayers on it. And you can potentially make some nice little synergies there, with your Cauldron being your general. So there's ways you can do it. But never take the Avatar of Khaine by itself on foot. It's just not worth it. You have to spend your first 2 turns literally wasting one of your prayers, having someone dedicated to awakening it, just so it can move up the field. Don't do it. Not unless you're just in it for the shits and giggles. Finally, if you want extra relics, which you kind of do, especially if you're playing one of the temples, because the temples, as we've said, they're all very good except for Kraith. Problem is that denies you a relic in certain circumstances. And you have some very good relics, particularly the ones for prayers, the Relics of Khaine. There are some good spellcasting ones as well. But the prayer ones, the Iron Circlet and a few others, are very good. So you might want the advantage and the CP involved in taking a battalion. Good go-to battalions are things like the Temple Nest. Should be built out of pretty decent units you already want. It forces you to take a little bit of attacks, but it's okay. The Shadow Patrol is very easy to build. It definitely is leaning heavy into your support units, but it's easy to build because you want those units anyway. And then the Slaughter Troop, which is okay. It's cheap, at least in terms of models. They range from, so those battalions, they range from easy to build with okay buffs to really great buffs for things like the Temple Nest. And then they give you the added advantages. So overall, it's an army that is certainly unique in this circumstance, in that they don't have a lot of options. All their options are viable to some extent, but some are clearly better than others. But the key thing when you want to play these, and that's just it, their price, right? The pitfall of, and things you need to know going into this army, is you need to know, this is what you should probably build first. Second, this is something you just need to be aware of when you play it in general. You need to hit first, you need to hit hard, and you need to be very aware of your movement and your positioning. That's what it's all going to come down to. In general, that's very good for just playing Age of Sigmar in general, is to be very aware of that, because it's a very movement-based game. But that is it for Daughters of Khaine. So, if you have any further questions on Daughters of Khaine, if you want me to go into more detail about certain things, you want to get my opinion on something, lists you want to throw at me, anything at all, if you have a suggestion for another army you want to see done, where you want to know about some of the stuff involved in it when you're going to collect it, leave a comment below. Leave comments below to just discuss Daughters of Khaine in general. Happy to get that discussion going, and we'll talk about what is good and what you need to know when it comes to beginners starting with Daughters of Khaine. So, thank you for watching. This has been Jay from Jade Productions, and I will see you next time.